Okay, I think we can start. Very warm welcome to the panel on the struggle for influence between Russia and the European Union within the European Security Week here at PRIO. This is my greatest privilege and honor to welcome you all here in this room and online as well. Thank you for joining us today. We have extremely excellent panel, I guess, with the speakers, with distinguished speakers throughout Europe, and I'm very honored to be moderating this panel today. My name is Zinaida Bechna. I'm from Department of IR and European Studies at Masaryk University in Czechia. So let me now introduce our great panelists first, and then we can proceed with some practical issues and questions, most importantly. So first I will start with Pavel Baev, who is the research professor here at Peace Research Institute Oslo, expert on Russian foreign and security policy, military strategy, and conflict management in regions including Caucasus and Russia, kind of near abroad, let's say, and their relationship with the European Union. So thank you for joining, Pavel. Laura Delacour, this is our great colleague and associate professor from Sorbonne Nouvelle University in Paris, and she has extremely huge expertise on EU neighborhood policy, EU-Russian relationship, and Euro-Asian regional dynamics, norm diffusion, competing policy frameworks, and their influence on making regional dynamics. So thank you for traveling and for joining us today. That's highly appreciated. Our dear colleague, Vladimir Gelman from Alexandria Institute at the University of Helsinki, professor on Russian and Euro-Asian studies at Alexandria Institute, and he is a distinguished expert on post-Soviet politics and governance, authoritarianism, political institutions, and regime dynamics, and how they shape policy making and policy development in Eastern Europe and Russia. So thank you, Vladimir, for being here. Professor Tracy German from King's College London, professor of conflict and security, is a distinguished scholar of Russian foreign and security policy with particular expertise in Russian strategic culture, military thoughts, and conflict dynamics across post-Soviet regions. Tracy, thank you for being here today and for traveling as well, a long way. And Professor Bo Peterson, last but not least, professor of political science at Malmö University and director of the Russian, Ukrainian, and the Caucasus region research center. Is also a distinguished scholar of Russian and post-Soviet politics, whose research expertise is on political myth, national identity, authoritarian legitimacy, and diffusion of other authoritarian practices across Eurasia. Also, thank you so much for joining us and for traveling for this panel today. So I'm now also expected to show you the fire exits. So from your perspective, it's on your right-hand side and then in the back. And for online participants, I guess you all know where your fire exits are. I hope we won't need them, though. Okay, so we proceed with the questions first, and then we will leave some space for your questions at the end. Well, I'll start with the first question with a very broad and maybe conceptual one in that sense. Yesterday we had discussions and panels on defense and more kind of military related issues when it comes to confrontation, especially between European Union and Russia in that sense, and how the war in Ukraine has changed dynamics in that sense. But this panel is more about to think of other aspects that are not necessarily military in that sense, that this confrontation could be understood as a struggle over ideas about how political order should be organized, let's say, and how the impact of the war or Russian aggression against Ukraine has shifted these dynamics in the countries between the European Union and Russia. So the first question, as I mentioned, is a very conceptual one and goes with how we would understand and how we should understand, let's say, this confrontation over different visions of sovereignty, security, democracy, values, and regional orders in that sense. And should we understand this rivalry as a genuine clash of diffusions, a competition over political ideas, institutions, and models of order, or has the war transformed it into a primary geopolitical struggle over power, security, and control? I'll start, Vladimir, with you, if I may.
Thanks for this excellent introduction. And my response will be based upon our joint project, CENTREPEACE. We conduct together with PRIO and Masaryk colleagues, and within the framework of this project, Zinaida, Pavel, and me, and our Helsinki colleague, Katalin Mikloshi, are working on the article which has a title of Clash of Diffusions with a question mark, exactly what Zinaida said. It is under review now, but let me very briefly summarize our key point. That, well, there is a clash of diffusion between the European Union and Russia as a part of a bigger picture of diffusion of authoritarianism and democracy in various parts of the globe. And this picture, however, somewhat incomplete. Because if we are looking only on these big global actors, we often downplay the agency of countries in between and not pay enough attention to their domestic factors, whether or not these diffusions are accepted or rejected, or there is something else. And this was the focus of our analysis, the interplay of domestic and international factors, and we compared Georgia, Ukraine before 2014, Moldova, and Armenia. So the clash of diffusions not necessarily mean some sort of zero-sum game, as many actors in countries in between tend to serve as servant of two masters before 2022, and apparently the war changed this picture quite a bit toward various directions. And the second point is that mechanisms of diffusion are rather diverse, and while authoritarian diffusion is driven by cursive mechanisms, democratic diffusions are about normative mechanisms. Let me stop at this point.
Okay, thank you. Tracy, if I...
Thank you. So I'd agree with that, and I think I'll go one step further. Obviously, I think it's both. I think it's, a clash of both, ideas about political order, but also a struggle over geopolitics and territory. I think, what we're seeing across the, let's call it the common neighbourhood, is both. And you talked about the agency, Vladimir, of the states caught in between. And I think what's most interesting about this clash is it comes down to different conceptions of how you exercise power. And the EU really focusing on what's been termed the power of authority, legitimacy, of seeking to push, these norms, ideals, and through an attractive way. And, the agency of those states caught in between is that EU engagement in the common neighbourhood has been demand-driven, and I think we tend to not overlook that potentially. And by contrast, the clash has appeared because Russia has focused more on domination, on coercion, on the military and economic levers. And I think what we've seen is when those two different exercises of power come, together, we've ended up where we are today. I think moving forwards, the question that we have to consider really is there space for coexistence of these different approaches across the common neighbourhood? Because these competing approaches, these competing views of political order have, really I think shrunk room for coexistence moving forwards. And I think for me, that's a big question.
Yeah, Bo, please.
That's me. Yes, let me agree with what you just said there, Tracy, that this is not a question of either or. This is a matter of both, and it's not. It's both a competition over political ideas and norms, of course, but it's also a more of a classical geopolitical struggle over security matters. And I guess we can agree more or less that the times when we spoke in idealistic terms about normative power of Europe, that sorry and manners, but those days are gone, and seemingly belong to the past. But we can see, for instance, now that the EU members or EU members that are NATO members are forced to go into spending, aiming for 5% of the GNPs on defense matters due to the U.S. withdrawal, partly from European defense commitments. That is one sign, of course, in the sky that normative power is not all that there is to it, hard from it. And we can see other examples in the same direction, like the French offers to let other states huddle under their nuclear umbrella, of course. And that is also very, very far away from the normative power ideals. And then on the other side of the fence, we see also, of course, that in matters of the Russian defense doctrine, security doctrine, threats to traditional values are explicitly termed as security threats. So that is also another sign that these two kind of forces or dynamics, the norm dynamics and the security dynamics, they go together and become increasingly entangled with each other.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Laura?
Thank you. So I would definitely agree. It's both, but the balance between the two has changed over time. In the early 2010s, well, the deterioration of EU-Russia interaction started over ideas and norms, with two different projects being launched, the Eurasian Economic Union and in response to the EU's Eastern Partnership, which in fact reflected different visions of the political order. But then obviously Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine tilted the balance towards the geopolitical struggle. And the war for Russia is very much about territorial control, but also probably strategic depth, preventing NATO expansion and so on. And yet it's quite interesting to see that the ideational dimension has not vanished at all. It's still very much present. Just a few examples. The war is very much framed by Russia as a continuous struggle against a collective West, which is broadly regarded as decadent. And on the other side, the EU broadly frames Ukraine as a defender of democracy, standing against Russia for the sake of the whole continent. So the ideational dimension is still very much there, I would say, even though the question of territorial control and so geopolitics has gained salience and is prominent, and will probably remain critical in the resolution of the war. However, which political model will emerge after the war is a central question also, not only for the EU and Russia, but also for Eastern European and South Caucasus countries.
That's right. Yeah, thank you. Pavel.
Not that much to add, but let me start with a slight disagreement with Tracy. I think in Russian policies in that region, the strongest instrument is not military pressure and coercion. I think it is corruption, with the exception of Ukraine. That's an entirely special case. But answering to your question, I think in this clash of diffusions, I can give you 4 cases, one short sentence each. Turkmenistan, clearly despotic regime, maintains generally constructive relations with the European Union. Azerbaijan, a clearly despotic regime, is in a long-term quarrel with Russia. In the course of Armenian revolution in the 18th, not a single European flag was visible, and now they are coming more and more. In Georgia, on the other hand, which was a strongly pro-European country, Russian influence is driving it away. That's 4 cases. And from that, I derive a formula of this clash of diffusions of 2 parts. The first part is that Russian influence in this area is always anti-democratic and anti-European, but not every despotic regime in this country is pro-Russian. And the second part is that the EU policy in this area is not always anti-Russian, is not always pro-democratic, but every democratic government, movement, opposition in this region is necessarily pro-European.
That's a very nice wrap-up. Thank you. Now let's move towards a little bit European Union. We mentioned a bit of about the European Union in your answers, and of course, when we're talking about clash of diffusions, which is a very complex issue in itself. But when we look and zoom into the European Union as it is, very often we describe that Russian invasion against Ukraine has been European Zeitenwende, or Europe's 9/11, or an epochal transformation in European affairs. So I wonder, what is your opinion on what has changed most? It's a hard question, I guess, and very complex, in EU actorness since 2022. And by actorness, I mean, EU's capabilities, presence, opportunities, in their political will, or our political will, and strategic autonomy concerning, of course, the region that we are discussing here. So if I can ask Tracy to start with.
So if pushed, I would say political will has changed the most, because that is driving changes in capability. And I think that's largely because the war shattered assumptions that had been underpinning European approaches to security for so many years, for decades. It shattered the assumption that large-scale interstate war in Europe was, a thing of the past. And what happened in 2022, I think, made it very clear that war between states on the European continent was plausible and viable, and therefore there was a real emphasis both on the clear threat to European states and a sense of what was at stake. And it took, I think, the full-scale invasion in 2022 to make that very clear, leading to that much stronger sense of shared threat perception, and therefore, pushing for much greater spending on defence, these unprecedented sanctions against Russia, military assistance through the European Peace Facility, the support for Ukraine, etc., and much, much greater coordination on defence and security issues, which I think has been a very significant change. But I think it's not just the war since 2022, and I'm sure some of the other people on this panel will talk about it. I think Trump's return to the White House has really kind of shaken up thinking and made it even clearer that we need much stronger kind of European focus on defence.
Thank you, Pavel.
I, on this point, have no disagreements with Tricky. I think, indeed, capabilities is a work in progress, and we cannot take the progress for granted. But the mobilization of political will is remarkable, unexpected. It's really a European Union has ever done itself. But I think what we need to identify, to admit in this mobilization of political will, is US leadership. I think Biden's lead in mobilizing Europe to resist Russian aggression cannot be underplayed. We now tend to forget it because Trump is such a looming presence. But through the first 3.5 years of war, it was the US leadership that really helped Europe to mobilize, to unite, to have its Zeitenwende. And now it's a different situation altogether. This mobilization of political will needs to be sustained and converted into greater strategic autonomy, because that's the reality which Europe is facing and will continue to face for at least 2.5 more years. Remains to be seen how and to what degree the damage done by Trump can be undone in the next swing. I think swing is probably coming in the US policy. But for Europe, the course towards strategic autonomy is no less difficult than building up its capabilities, also working, which is only in the very beginning in many ways. Still, it's building of capabilities started earlier. Building of strategic autonomy is yet to be accomplished. And I hope we collectively will contribute to that.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's definitely political will. And I'm not even sure that the EU is realizing that it was, able to do this. Because, there's such a long-standing track record of EU not being able to deliver, not even to deliver, but in fact to decide during crisis. And this was hugely different in terms of the EU being able to decide overnight over sanctions, over massive aid to Ukraine, over enlargement as well. So moving forward and resolving at least seemingly divisive issues. So political will is crucial because it is a precondition indeed for enhanced capabilities and strategic autonomy. So it's definitely premised, in my view, on shared threat perceptions, which is something entirely new. For instance, in France, Russia was never perceived as a threat until 2022. And this started drastically changing. And Trump, in my view, is part of the picture as well in terms of shared threat perceptions. It was never perceived, the US was never perceived as a threat to the east of the continent. Now it started changing. So this is very much a precondition. And as Pavel and Tracy said, in terms of capabilities, in terms also of strategic autonomy, well, it's very much a moving target. It's still a process. Also because the way in which the EU understands security, power, and also its own role in international relations is changing. It's in the making.
Yeah, thank you. Vladimir?
I completely agree that there is a major change in actorness after 2022. Before that, actorness mostly addressed economic development, but not much security issues. And now there is a dramatic change on this front. Having said that, I would say that actorness is very much work in progress because the EU has a very complicated structure, the need for building a consensus, and the very fact that Orban government in Hungary was able not completely block many initiatives, but made a lot of problems for the EU as a whole and for other EU countries in particular is a powerful reminder. And definitely this was an undermining of EU capability from within, in addition to efforts from Russia and from the US from outside. And this issue is still on agenda, as we might expect that there will be somewhat similar challenges like that in various other EU countries, and definitely if there will be the further rise of right-wing parties in countries like Germany and France, it may challenge EU actorness to a much greater degree than Orban did in the previous years. So this is very much work in progress, and the only sign of hope is that, well, successful post-2022 experience may persuade both European elites and citizens of European countries that EU actually matters. Thank you.
Oh.
Yes, thank you. Well, this panel is in utter agreement on this issue. So in that sense, we are maybe a boring panel to listen to because, of course, it's political will that has undergone the major changes since 2022. But I would like to kind of contest the formulation of the question a little bit, because I would tend to actually argue that it's not as much the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 that constituted the Zeitenwende for Europe. It's actually the Trumpian reorientation, and it's partial withdrawal from Europe and its defense commitment, because this has really been experienced as a stab in the back, which was no one really could see coming, and not in the full scale of of the fact, but particularly symbolized perhaps also in the many rhetorical kind of moves to take over Greenland from a partner country, which is unprecedented, and that so I would say if something is Europe's 9/11, it's the Trumpian return, and it's monstrous transformation of U.S. security policy.
Absolutely. Let me now talk about or ask you more about EU as an actor, in a sense that to discuss more in detail, that there has been a lot of academic discussion about European Union coming of age as a foreign and security policy actor in that sense. So my question is, can the EU remain a principal actor while becoming more geopolitical one in that sense, or does the securitization of enlargement, energy, industry and defense risk changing the EU identity altogether? We can start with Laura, please.
Yes, thank you. I will also challenge the question.
Okay.
To start with, I mean, actorness or identity is not monolithic, right? It's and again, sorry, Jan Manners, but the EU was never a purely normative actor in the first place. Never, ever. It has quite often and well before 2022 prioritized, for instance, security interest over values or stability. Take, for instance, the Southern Mediterranean or migration issues, the deal in 2016 with Turkey, or you mentioned, Pavel, Azerbaijan. Well, I'd like to know why the EU has consistently imposed conditionality on Belarus and never introduced ever a single measure vis-à-vis Azerbaijan. So the EU was never a purely normative power. And second, identity or actorness is not set in stone. It evolves through interactions with others, also in the wake of critical junctures, and obviously Russia's full-scale invasion is such a moment. So what we are witnessing is rather a kind of shifting actorness, a kind of hybrid identity with normative and geopolitical elements. So let me just pick the example of enlargement policy. Obviously, enlargement has become much more political over the past few years because security is now a driver. And the geopolitical situation around Europe has definitely accelerated the process. But at the same time, and we conducted interviews with EU member states as part of a Horizon Europe project, it is very much a value-driven process as well, a merit-based approach. And so the EU is not going to give up on the so-called fundamentals. And this reflects the fact that EU actorness is currently more hybrid. The key question is to what extent and how these two identities can coexist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Tracy?
Yeah, I think I would agree. And I think if we look at what's happened in recent weeks and the EPC, the European Political Community meeting in Yerevan, I think that demonstrates clearly that kind of hybrid nature of the EU's identity, because on the one hand, you know, it's very much about security and geopolitics, the question of enlargement or not, but also pushing this normative aspect. And I think it's starkly highlighted that the divisions that still remain. And obviously I know, EPC is separate to the EU, but I think some of the challenges that come out of that and came out of the meeting and Russia's response, both, at the presidential level and elsewhere, the deep anger that there appears to be about the European dissent on Yerevan, as it was termed, I think really highlights the challenges moving forwards.
Pavel.
I think coming of age is an interesting metaphor, and we need to clarify what age we mean. Because if we're speaking about the age which is now defined by United States as an age where might makes right, where only force matters, I don't think European Union can be coming of that age. I think it very much remains in the age where rule of law matters, where norms, democratic norms, are essential. And in fact, the United States were kind of a great upholder of these democratic norms until Trump. That was the main slogan, at least, of Biden's administration. So it's not necessarily that one age comes after another, like in chronology. I think there is a considerable overlap and there is a competition between these two ages. And Europe is an important anchor which remains in that age of the rule of law and democratic norms. And I think that for Europe it's essential being able to protect, certainly against the rule, the age where might makes right. It needs to build up capabilities. It needs to build up strategic autonomy. It needs building muscle power. But at the same time, this is only the means towards ensuring that the age of rule of law continues.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Picking up on Pavel's observation about what do you mean by age, maybe it is fair to say that it's not as much coming of age as rather, is it perhaps getting closer to retirement age, being past its prime? I mean, even if EU never was a normative power according to the manners terminology, then of course the post-Cold War period was a peak in many ways, and also the period of Euro complacency. That the rest of the world had to kind of sign into this the principles of democracy and rule of law and human rights, and we all wish back to those days for sure. But we can also see that it's a different kind of world out there right now, and there are slight signs that it's going to change. Not very many kilometers away from my hometown, there is now the NATO foreign ministers meeting in Helsingborg going on, discussing these matters and looking out over the straits. We're on between Denmark and Sweden, where on a daily basis you can see vessels from the Russian shadow fleet passing by. So it's definitely a different kind of world, and in that sense, the old position as being a beacon of norms that is maybe a luxury that the EU countries can no longer afford to uphold.
Thank you, Vladimir.
A small addition to what already been said by panelists. It's really hard to speak about EU actorness in all of the dimensions, because the picture is very much different in different policy areas, more specific and nuances, be it about sanctions, be it about military issues and the like, and also vis-a-vis different in between countries. there is a huge disappointment with recent developments in Georgia, but some hopes on Armenia, and very much inconsistent but steady progress in Moldova and the like. So there is no unified and one-dimensional trajectory, but rather very diverse and multiple trajectories of EU actorness, and I believe that this diversity will be observed over time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Now let's move forward. We've mentioned, the panelists mentioned that the states and countries in between and their agency here, right? So for a long time we observed that the countries in between they have been treated as a kind of that they were in some type of strategic waiting room in that sense, not fully inside the Euro-Atlantic order, but not simply part of Russian sphere either. So the war in Ukraine has shown how dangerous this ambiguity can become. And that's what Tracy emphasized very nicely, I think, if there is this space for coexistence in that sense. Yet the EU is already sometimes, in different discussions, we hear this, narratives about being overstretched because of challenges we are having inside the European Union in itself. And many member states are hesitant about further enlargement or especially security commitments in that sense. So the question in this context would be, can Europe still afford grey zones on its eastern and southeastern borders, or are these grey zones now one of the main source of European insecurity? And if the war in Ukraine has shown that that grey zones can become zones of war, what should Europe do with states that are outside both the European Union and NATO, but are more exposed to other influences, and I mean authoritarian influences? So should the answer would be faster enlargement, stronger security, guarantees, resilience building, or a new model of partnerships other than, for example, Eastern Partnership? This is a big, complex question, but I will ask Pavel to start with.
Yes, definitely the formula of European partnership is no longer applicable. And the 6 countries of that partnership are really now all over the place. It's not gray zone because the range of colors is very different. And Belarus is one thing and Moldova entirely different. And Ukraine makes an absolutely special case, which probably will be essential for finding a new pattern of relations with the states, because how the question of Ukraine very strong desire to join European Union will be resolved, I think that will be a decisive moment. But I think that for the European Union, it's very important not to give false hopes. And it's particularly the case in the South Caucasus. Armenia comes now under severe pressure from Russia. European Union cannot provide any security guarantees. That's a fact of life. And I think that besides very clearly kind of needed focus on Ukraine, the country where European Union can make a difference, can achieve important results without converting that into a larger pattern is Moldova. I think there, the very scale of the problem is such that it is feasible, it is doable, it's possible to focus on that and concentrate resources there and achieve a result that will bring new hopes to many others, even where hopes at the moment are rather slim. Thank you.
Thank you. Vladimir?
Yeah, I would agree with Pavel that the European Union have very limited leverages both vis-à-vis particular countries such as Armenia and more importantly on Georgia, but also there is no kind of universal solution. And definitely it is a matter of domestic elites in these in-between countries, their preferences, their considerations and foreign policy orientations. And we see that while, for example, in Moldova, very deep and protracted polarization and the powerful presence of Moldovan diaspora in Europe are key factors which contributed to this pro-European leaning of Moldova. Say in Georgia, situation is very much different, both because of Russia's economic leverages and because of the bitter experience of 2008 war, which put under question any European hopes of Georgia. So this means that there is no universal solution, and I believe that European politicians can learn some lessons from previous experience, but these lessons may come in vain without active engagement of elites and societies in between countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Laura.
Yes, thank you. So going back to the idea of grey zone, in fact, the European neighbourhood policy was very much based on the idea of a grey zone, on the idea of limes, meaning the neighbours being regarded as a kind of buffer zone. And this was obviously premised on a very asymmetrical relationship back then, and also on a one-size-fits-all approach. But the EU then got very diverse responses. Having grey zone on the EU's fringes is no longer possible because it's costly, because there are spillover risks. If you take, for instance, the war in Ukraine, it may definitely spill over to neighboring regions because there are new areas and tools that create instability. Remember what happened at the Polish-Belarusian border in 2021. I would definitely agree with what Pavel and Vladimir said about the EU's limitations, definitely. But still, the EU could fast-track enlargement with Moldova and Ukraine, even though this is a highly divisive issue within the bloc, could also perhaps offer enhanced security guarantees for Moldova in particular. There is this new security partnership that was agreed 2 years ago and which is unprecedented. And then with Armenia, in fact, we should not forget about partner countries' agency. Armenia never said it wants to rely exclusively on the EU. What Armenia is doing is, in fact, diversification of foreign policy. India, for instance, has emerged as a new partner. So perhaps the EU could help build resilience rather than offer security, which obviously it cannot do. What I find much more worrying is the case of Georgia, because it's a blatant illustration of the EU's not security, but normative limitations.
Thank you. Bo.
Yes, thank you. These are, of course, very difficult questions to address, and I agree with my colleagues that the EU is probably not the panacea for all problems on the borders. It cannot be, due to its financial, economic, and other limitations. But I do also agree that Ukraine is a special case here, and for symbolic reasons, for moral reasons, for all kinds of reasons, that the EU needs to try to design a way to bring Ukraine in as soon as possible. Otherwise, I would definitely advise against faster EU enlargement as a solution, because there are examples from the past when that was not so very useful in the longer run. I mean, there is probably a rather widespread agreement that the enlargement to Bulgaria and Romania was premature, due to the fact that they did not live up to the standards of combating internal corruption. The Big Bang enlargement per se brought in Hungary, for instance, and Poland, and we now have a situation when those the consequences are temporarily, to a large extent, overcome, concerning the liberal governments that were at the helm for quite some time, but it is caution against premature enlargements that might kind of bring in, maybe not seeds of destruction, but seeds of disagreement and internal tensions into the setup, which may be hazardous and precarious for the EU in the longer run.
Thank you. Tracy.
This notion of a strategic waiting room, I would suggest actually it's more like leaving states to wait out on the street, in terms of making them so vulnerable. And the EU has always emphasised the right of these states to choose their future and their future political, structures, etc., over, Russia's insistence on its right to assertive influence. But that really has just left them incredibly vulnerable. And the example of Georgia, I think, is so important here. And you were talking there about the fact that perhaps we should be accelerating Ukraine's membership. If perhaps there had been more emphasis on trying to, bring Georgia in and provide it with more support post 2008. And it's all counterfactual here. Would we be in the situation we're in now? And I think, the EU's just, there seemed to be an assumption that states in between, on the periphery, whatever we want to call them, in the grey zone, could just continue in this kind of neither nor existence indefinitely. And that, I think, even at the time, a decade ago, there were people going, but this is wrong, that this is making them vulnerable. And it's led to some very stark choices now, I think, that I'm not sure the EU has specific answers for. And that comes down to these internal tensions that have been mentioned, both within the EU, but also within the states, that we're talking about themselves, be that Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. And I think that it also goes with, this identity issue as well, the normative power thing that if, something what we see in Georgia in that sense, the attractiveness of the European Union's normative power in that sense, what Laura, you have mentioned as well, I think also is very important in that sense. Okay. I will have just one last question, and then we can proceed with the questions from the audience. And this question is about building, let's say, new new order in a sense when we're talking about the struggle for influence between these rival powers in this region. And the principles that have been here, especially when we're talking about, this the European power, that the principles that the borders would not be changed by force, that economic interdependence could reduce conflicts, this logic behind of this cooperation, and that Russia could somehow be included in cooperative European order that was, in previous 90s, let's say. Now the situation is completely different, and those assumptions no longer hold. That's for true. But what kind of European security order is now emerging, if we have to think about that broadly, just to wrap up the panel's discussion on that? We've heard that agency matters, of course. It's context specific. It's about, the interests of different actors. And of course, there's geopolitical contestation outside EU-NATO borders. But then we clash with these normative issues, and that's what complicates the picture even more. So if those older assumptions in that sense are not working anymore, when based mainly on deterrence and containment of Russia, it would be a new kind of response to that, how to deal with this new situation, or one that still leaves room for future coexistence, negotiations, or selective engagement. That may be something, Tracy, you mentioned from the very beginning, if there is this room for coexistence, and what would be this new kind of security arrangement for these regions caught in between. I will start with Bo, with you.
Yes, thank you. I guess obviously, as long as the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine goes on, there is no room for those kind of envisaging the more benevolent scenarios of future coexistence, negotiation, and engagement. So that is statement number one in this case. We cannot kind of ignore what is going on. The EU cannot ignore, cannot afford to ignore, and has not the right to ignore. So as long as that situation goes on, it is the roads of deterrence and containment that apply. But then, of course, we again have the considerations that are brought need to be brought to the table by the uncertainty concerning U.S. role in Europe. So in that sense, in the somewhat longer run, maybe the EU needs to be more pragmatic in relation to its Russian neighbor than it would ideally have had to be otherwise. Had the US been so to speak been sane again. But in any way, in any case, it seems very far-fetched now to see the kind of Europe in the OSCE heyday of consensus-based solutions concerning security arrangements and political contexts anymore. So that those days seem to be long gone. And what will arise in its stead? We don't have a clue, unfortunately.
Yeah, Laura, I can ask.
Yes, I would definitely agree with the two-step scenario, containment, and then if the war of aggression ends, and when it ends only, then perhaps a more pragmatic engagement with Russia, not transformational, but really selective and pragmatic. Just want to say that to stress that the current context is highly challenging for the EU, because it's not just about the post-Cold War security order. What is being questioned are the very premises upon which EU integration developed, meaning that, economic interdependence, not prevents war and multilateralism and so on. So this requires really, from the EU side, moving beyond the very foundation upon which it developed and beyond navel gazing, probably, to develop a strategic vision, which so far it has proved unable to do, in my view.
Thank you. Vladimir?
Yeah, the major problem we observe now is very much protracted war, and while in the very beginning it was an expectation that, okay, Russia will take over Kiev in 72 hours or in 96 hours or something like that. Now, more than 4 years on, the expectation is quite different, and many people, myself including, assume that the war will continue as long as Vladimir Putin is in power in Russia, which means that it may take not years but decades. From this perspective, yes, strategic containment and deterrence will be on agenda as a priority for Europe in the longer run. Not only as an immediate response to the war, but rather a long-term political feature. To what extent it will be feasible, and whether or not there will be a turn to some sort of pragmatic, selective engagement with Russia, it's really hard to say. But what is important that this dimension will be prioritized in EU policy as a matter of survival, similarly to the early years of the Cold War. And we can't predict how this change may affect the EU as a whole and particular European countries, but I do believe that this priority of deterrence and containment may transform the European Union to a great degree, and this increase of defense spending, rearmament, change toward unification of military aspects of policies, what we discussed extensively yesterday, is not just an immediate response, but a principal feature of European politics for a long period of time. Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pavel. If I can ask.
Yes. I think that attempts now to envisage the contours of European security system cannot be really fruitful, because it really depends upon what sort of Russia we'll be dealing with. And I don't think Russia can sustain this war for another year even. The war needs to be brought. The pattern of this war has become unsustainable for Russia. A pause in the war immediately brings in all sorts of crises inside Russia, not least because kind of the sustainability of the Putin's Russia was very much dependent upon subjugating Ukraine, and this task cannot be achieved. It's a strategic failure. How this crisis inside Russia will develop, we'll discuss tomorrow at a different panel. It is entirely possible that Russia will, in the course of this crisis, will be transformed into something entirely unrecognizable, both in terms of its borders, in terms of its governance, in terms of its society. One factor which European Union needs really to focus on in this not quite post-war period is rehabilitating Ukraine. And that makes a lot of impacts on the development inside Russia implicitly, but that in itself is a task of colossal proportions. When we think that Ukraine has lost a half of its population, not just certainly in casualties, but due to occupation and due to immigration, there is hardly much hope that the immigration can be reversed. And the scope of destruction of infrastructure, in the scope of destruction of the cities and the economy is colossal. And Ukraine is completely dependent upon the European Union on this task. There is nobody else to help. So in this sense, whether European Union will accelerate the process of Ukraine's accession isn't very important, because it will be completely the task for which European Union will be responsible. And whether it will be kind of up to that task remains to be seen. But certainly the significance of that is not only kind of humanitarian, in a sense that this victim of aggression needs all the support it can get, but also in the impact it will have upon Russia, which may be kind of well beyond of what we can imagine at the moment.
Thank you. And Tracy?
So obviously I agree with all of the points, but I think, deterrence, containment of Russia taking centre stage, absolutely, but that's going to depend a lot on NATO. And there are some very big question marks, I think, moving forwards over NATO and the US role within Europe. I mean, Trump's announcement this week, or the rumours we're hearing coming out of the White House, that the US is going to reduce the number of troops available for NATO operations within Europe. I think these are deeply concerning for NATO. So I think there are some very big questions there about how Europe writ large is able to continue to deter, what role the US will continue to play. And then this notion of economic interdependence and war or not. And actually interdependence is raising kind of your vulnerabilities. And I think we're seeing that very much at the moment over US war with Iran, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and some of the global implications. So I think there are so many question marks that are outside of the control of European states at the moment, which I think are deeply troubling. Yeah. Sorry to end on such a pessimistic.
Yeah, well, we see that there are a lot of questions related to such a developments in the countries of we're analyzing here. But that was the last question, as I promised, and we have a little bit of time for your questions and comments, thoughts. So, yes, Petra, please identify yourself so people outside and online can...
Petra Kuchinkova from Masaryk University. Thank you very much for this very fruitful and interesting discussion to all of the panelists. I would like to ask, we were talking here about this shifting identity, role of the European Union as the international actor, evolving actorness. I would like to ask whether you think that this international identity of European Union, this role, its actorness can be changed or somehow shifted without changes of EU primary law. Because if the European Union if we can work with the mechanisms, decision-making mechanisms and instruments that we now have in the primary law, because of course this process of changing of primary law can be also contested, controversial. Some countries may see introduction of qualified majority voting in these sensitive areas as another dictate from Brussels. So what is less evil in this process? Thank you.
Yeah, we can take another one. Yeah, or we can, yeah, okay. Any other questions? Then, yes, you. Okay, sorry.
Nick Marsh from PRIO. I have a question just regarding the premise that I think some of you mentioned that it'd be very difficult to have a sort of peaceful or coexistence with Russia while there is an ongoing war in Ukraine. And I'm just thinking back to the Cold War, when you had periods when it was very hot, the late 60s, for example, early 70s. You had tens of thousands of US troops being killed in Vietnam. You have the invasion of Czechoslovakia. But this was also a period in which, this was the high point of arms control. You had numerous agreements between the US, Soviet Union. You had multilateral agreements involving them both. So it seemed that back then it was possible to actively manage the relations at the same time as though there was high intensity war going on. So I was wondering, what's different now? I'm not disagreeing with you, but then I'm wondering, okay, how is the current system different to what it was in, say, the late 60s, early 70s? Why is it so difficult to imagine those kind of agreements to manage relations that were possible then but seem to be very difficult or impossible now?
Yeah, I think we can respond to these two questions and then take another one. Yeah? Okay, good. And I don't know if any of you would like to pick up with one of those questions. Yes, Laura, please.
Thank you very much. So very briefly about your question on the Cold War, I can see two major differences, but then I'm sure that Bo will elaborate on this. I think during the Cold War there was a degree of predictability and certainty that is no longer there. And then the other major difference is that international relations were very much structured by USSR competition, which is obviously no longer the case, as we can see a number of third actors. Then moving to the identity shift, EU identity shift, and whether it's possible without a change of treaty, I think yes. Not because I don't want to come across very naive or optimistic, but a lot of things in the EU integration process have developed outside the treaties. Schengen process, yes, started outside the treaty. The coalition of the willing, to take another example. So there are many, ways or practices in which the EU can go further without any treaty change, which obviously cannot be envisaged at the moment.
Yes, thank you. On that second question concerning what's the difference between now and then the situation during the Cold War. First of all, the obvious is that the Cold War was a Cold War. This is a hot war. There are actually atrocities going on every day, and people die. And that cannot be in the midst of Europe, and that cannot be ignored by the European Union. And your parallel to the Vietnam War, of course, is well taken, but that's still long distance away from Europe. So that's the obvious answer, I would say.
Can I just add on that as well? I mean, it took time to bed in the rules of the game, didn't it? And you're talking about the 60s and 70s there. We're a couple of decades in. So I think that's a significant difference.
I believe that during the Cold War, there was a major drive towards strategic stability and preservation of the status quo, both from the United States and from the Soviet Union. What we see now is a desire for undermining of the status quo from both the United States and from Russia, albeit for different reasons. And this is why nobody cares about strategic stability, probably except for the EU. I can't say anything about China. It's a different matter. And this is completely different from what has been observed during the Cold War.
Yes, I think one thing to add about the difference between the Cold War is that now, presently, in the war which is ongoing, the nuclear weapons, which back then was possible to separate from local wars, being at Vietnam and Korea and many others in Africa in particular, are now an integral part of this confrontation. And in Russian policies, the only way to soften the strategic defeat is to rely more on the nuclear free capacity, so to say. And we observed that this week with the unprecedented nuclear exercises. The hope is that it still be possible to avoid the nuclear escalation of the ongoing war, which we cannot take for granted. But I think it is something where the difference is probably the most visible. And as for the question on the need to revise the fundamentals of the European Union, I think it's unavoidable. I think that, again, it's not an act, it's always a process. And many foundations of the European Union institutions and the kind of rules of its bureaucratic work have been revised all the time, but something much more fundamental, something much more radical, I think, is unavoidable, even if the kind of bureaucratic tradition probably would resist against that.
Okay, great. Do we have other questions? I see one here. Yes, 3 questions. So we start with the Veli-Pekka.
Yeah, thank you. Veli-Pekka Tynkkynen, University of Helsinki. In the beginning, you discussed this kind of EU, Europe as a normative actor or a geopolitical actor. And my question is that whether it has to be either or, in a sense that these examples that how we relate differently to Azerbaijan or Belarus can be said, okay, we're losing our altruistic norms because of these kind of practices. But actually, you can argue that geographical proximity is something that is related to our norms and values that we protect more fiercely. So in that sense, can you elaborate on actually that how Europe can be both a geopolitical actor and a normative actor that is kind of respected and the norms still value or are valid?
Thank you. Martin? There. There.
I think my question, Martin Irišek, Masaryk University. My question is a follow-up to Veli-Pekka's question, or you can answer that as a bundle, if you will, because again, I like to play the devil's advocate. So once again, I will do that. You elaborated on the EU being a geopolitical actor. My question is that really the case? Because does the EU have what it takes to be a geopolitical actor, to make a change? Does the EU have the phone number, the proverbial phone number, that can be dialed or addressed? Does the EU have the tools to make the change beyond or besides the normative power that irradiates outside the EU in the so-called Brussels effect? So this is a very fundamental question, because the EU is a normative power, I think, but whether it actually is on par with geopolitical actors that now dictate the shape of the international order is a question of a different nature. So my question is very, very fundamental in this case. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we have one question here.
Hi, I'm Matej from Christiania University. You've touched briefly upon Moldova and Azerbaijan and all these countries that have actually been the subject of Russian influence operations. So I see that we do discuss a lot about growing the defense capabilities in terms of military power, but Europe is against one of the biggest players when it comes to influence operations. So I'm wondering, what hope does Europe effectively have to counter this, because while some countries in Europe might not be hit with rockets and drones, the damage done by these kind of operations is lasting and is quite serious. And I guess I'm wondering if the EU can actually hope to protect or even begin to imagine protecting countries when it comes to this like information warfare domain.
Thank you. No, we can probably pick up the questions and respond. Anybody to start? Yeah. Bo? Yeah? Okay, good.
Yes, concerning the first two questions, I think that goes in line with pretty much what we have been saying on this panel, that it is not really a matter of either or, it's a matter of both and I think it also summarizes the discussion that even though the expression coming of age was used and a bit kind of also criticized, then I think we were quite in agreement that EU is still not there. It's wishing to establish itself as a geopolitical power, but it doesn't have the muscles so far, and it will take quite some time before they acquire it. But if ever, but in principle, of course, then both options, both tools are there in the toolbox, and they can be combined. It's not a zero-sum game in that sense. And I think that concerning the last question there, I'm not the most qualified on the panel to answer to that one, but I would assume that the collected brain power in Europe would be sufficient to kind of come up with counter strategies in that field. But there was an eminent panel preceding this one this morning that took up these issues.
I'll just address that question, and actually you just talked about the panel that preceded ours, and that question of vulnerabilities within society, and that, you know, these information, these cognitive warfare strategies only really have success when there's receptive audiences and divisions already exist and vulnerabilities already exist. And I think that's one of the real challenges for European states at the moment, is that many states are divided internally and politically, and polarized. And I think that produces very fertile ground then for, let's call them information operations, political warfare, etc. If you have a divided society, if you've got political groups that are very divided, and I mean the UK, obviously we're no longer a European Union member, but we are incredibly divided internally, and it's, the extremes, the political extremes are there, and it's very fertile ground for malign influence if that so wishes.
Regarding this discussion on geopolitical actors, I believe that there is no either or perspective, but also it is a certain dynamics. Before 2022, the very statement about this geopolitical actors of the EU was not on the agenda entirely. Now we see some attempts, but as Bucharest correctly pointed out, it will take a certain time. But my understanding that, increasing challenges, from Russia, from the US, from elsewhere, will contribute to building of this actors to quite a big degree. So maybe in some time from now, the answer on Martin's question will be more affirmative than we observe now. But of course, it's always a difficult business of making certain forecasting. So I would refrain from this.
Yes, I don't think any of us ever said that the EU is a fully-fledged geopolitical actor. What we said is that identity is shifting, is hybrid, but it's certainly not a geopolitical actor. What the EU has started doing, and that was actually prior to the full-scale invasion, is factoring geopolitics in its own policies. And that happened in 2013 with Armenia's backtracking from the association agreement, when the EU started realizing that it offered something technical to its neighbors, but then Russia responded geopolitically. And this is something that it did not previously factor in its policies. So this is where the change comes from. The point on geographical proximity is very interesting, and I think it makes sense. However, my problem here is that the EU does not factor geographical proximity in its policies, because it offered the very same policy to Azerbaijan and Belarus. But I find it really interesting.
Yes, I agree. Geography matters, even if the values and norms are supposed to be universal. There is a tension there, very distinguishable, and at the same time very difficult to incorporate into practical policymaking. So I think as far as Belarus is concerned, the political crisis of the year 2020 shows that the stability of that regime isn't really that rock solid, and that the ending of the war in Ukraine will certainly have an impact. The crisis on Russia will inevitably resonate in Belarus very strongly, and this country may suddenly become on track of much closer relations to the European Union. It now looks very dark, shadow of gray, but it is something which has far greater prospects in this regard than, for that matter, Turkmenistan or even Azerbaijan. And as far as kind of Russian influence, Russian capacity for exploiting divisions is concerned, I wouldn't really overestimate that. Neither the MAGA movement in the United States nor AfD in Germany are really results of Russian propaganda. And Russian ability to kind of connect with these movements and many others, the limits of that ability were very clearly demonstrated in Hungary, I think. For that matter, the capacity of European Union to exploit the tiredness of war in the Russian society, to connect with the tiredness of with Putin's regime more broadly, I think is far greater and needs to be activated more. So there is no need really to fear that much kind of Russian special operations in information space, while European Union possesses in this space capability far superior.
Okay, at least we end with some optimistic notes. And we're sharp on time. Sorry. So thank you for that. I think this panel was really thought-provoking, and it showed a lot of intertwined developments in this region, that it's not black and white, that's for sure, and it's in making. And with optimistic notes, let's wrap up with panel. Thank you so much for such an interesting discussions, and I hope that we will continue our discussions in next sessions. So please join me with a little bit of applause for the members. And thank you also for coming, and thank you all people online as well listening to us.